your body doesn't know bench press or squat or deadlift or jujitsu. It just knows I'm working. My muscles are trying to exert as much force against this external resistance, whether that's pieces of metal or a person.
Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Mayn Idea Podcast, where today I have the pleasure of sitting down once again with Chad Wesley Smith. A quick shout out to the sponsors of this show, Perry Athletics and Bubs Naturals. To take advantage of discounts on those products, please visit the show notes. And if you want to see the show grow in 2024, please take 30 seconds and leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and subscribe to the YouTube. This helps the show get discovered organically and helps me continue to bring on amazing guests. The other way that you can support the show is by simply sharing it with someone who's interested in martial arts, jiu-jitsu, strength training, and human performance. Chad Wesley Smith is the founder of my favorite strength training app, Juggernaut for BJJ, as well as Juggernaut Training Systems and Juggernaut AI app. He has personally developed the strength and conditioning programs for Otavio Souza, Romulo Barral, Felipe Pena, Neiman Gracie, and Felipe de la Monica, and now works alongside many successful mixed martial artists who are fighting in the UFC. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did. Without further ado, Chad Wesley Smith. Well, Chad, thank you for joining me once again. I have spent the last, basically every week of the last year using your training app, and I want to shout it from the rooftops. It's been extremely helpful in helping me manage volume and
Thank you very much.
Choosing exercises that are smart, that actually work for the sport of jiu-jitsu, for the hobby of jiu-jitsu. So I'm excited to dive back in and revisit this with you.
For sure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this past year, this thing has been continually showing up in my head when I'm training, and it's that I'll get to, and at this point I have done endurance programs that are on there. I've done strength specific programs that are on there, and I've always done them at like a 2 times a week frequency to try to not get injured, allow myself to train as much as I want, but still maintain my strength. For those that are curious about history there, we did a separate episode where we kind of dived into what training looked like in the past and the best frequencies here. So I get to the end of these programs and I'll do some sort of like as many reps as possible in an exercise, and it spits out an estimated max. And every single time I've been blown away that there's a strength byproduct of the training itself. I've always approached my entire life strength and conditioning as the goal of getting stronger. And I heard you breaking this down in a video on YouTube that you want strength to be a byproduct and not the actual focus of a program like this. So I'm wondering, now that I've felt that every single week, at the end of these programs for a year, what is that thought process? Why do we not want to pursue strength as the goal when we're doing something like training for a sport like jiu-jitsu?
Well, part of the answer was in there, and then part of it is just maybe semantics and how we choose to use some of these words. So the part that was of the answer that's in the question is we're training for the sport of jiu-jitsu, which isn't about lifting the most weight. It's about doing jiu-jitsu the best. And so the other part of it that, is kind of like I said, about how we choose to use some of these words and interpret some of these words, is that for increased force production is certainly a goal of the training. How that force production is measured, lifting more in a specific barbell exercise, is what is the byproduct. So the ability to produce more force is certainly an objective of the training. And, that's why athletes should be and are in the weight room, is to learn how to produce more force. Doing it specifically for the sake of I'm going to bench press more, squat more, deadlift more, well, then you're crossing over into the realm of like strength in a specific exercise as a skill. There are people who put all of their intent towards improvement of squat, bench, and deadlift for the sport of powerlifting, or snatch and clean and jerk for the sport of weightlifting. And, their weight room time is their sport practice with that. And when non powerlifters and weightlifters and strong men, strong people, for the sport of strongman, are making the objective of their training lifting more in those specific exercises, that's where I think the problem starts to come in. Because in doing that, a lot of times they put so much attention and energy towards improving those exercises that they're going to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily have the highest return to their real goal of sport performance in whatever it is, jiu-jitsu, MMA, football, basketball, baseball. And because even like the best lifters of football players are best lifting jiu-jitsu guys, they're not good at lifting in the grand scheme of my world of powerlifting.
Right.
Like I work with a lot of NFL guys, and some of the best NFL players in the league right now, some of the best players ever. You'd see them in the weight room, and you're like, regular person, regular fan might be like, wow, they're super strong. But it's like, well, I see a guy who's 6'5", 315, and he benches 450. It's like, well, okay, like my peak powerlifting strength, I'd probably bench that for
Like a
8,
warm up.
10, something like
Yeah.
that. So I think that context is important too, that getting strong in the traditionally measured sense, squat, bench, deadlift, whatever exercises you want, being really strong relative to other jiu-jitsu guys isn't that hard in the grand scheme of powerlifting strength training. So that's why people, can and should be able to get plenty strong enough there without that being like, this is my singular objective goal, because they don't need to lift the weights of people whose sport is the singular objective goal of lifting more weights. Like the point of diminishing returns in, again, traditionally measured barbell strength, let's say the deadlift for jiu-jitsu, if you have a jiu-jitsu guy, I coach Hamulu Bahau for a number of years, at or near the peak of his career, and he deadlifted like a regular conventional straight bar deadlift from the floor, 500 pounds, when he weighed, 195, 198,
Right.
and was far stronger in that exercise than even Otavio Souza, or, was multiple 4-time world champion, or 3-time world champion, 4-time Pan Am, or Felipe Pena, or any of those guys. But 500 pounds at 200 pounds body weight, not really going to turn any heads at a powerlifting meet. So, but it was plenty strong for him to feel like, oh my God, this guy is so strong to do jujitsu with him. So what would be the point in spending the effort, to take that 500-pound deadlift to a 600-pound deadlift or a 700-pound deadlift? That, like, we just had a guy using our app break his own American record in the deadlift and pull 804 at 181. So the amount of energy, even for Homo to go from 500 to 550 or 500 to 600, would detract so much away from what he could do in his actual sport training jiu-jitsu. And what, would it make him any better? If he's already like, oh my God, this guy's so strong, it's like, is he going to be like, oh my Godder, this guy's so much stronger now? Like, no, it's going to be negligible at that point. Because if lifting the most weights was what made you the best, I'd be way better at jiu-jitsu.
Right. You'd be the champion of the world
Yeah.
already. Yeah. It's when you're working with these guys, Felipe Pena and Hamilo Bahal, and you see their athletic talent, right? And then you see someone like him pulling, again, for the average person, great numbers. For a professional powerlifter, horrible numbers. How do you decide what is best for them as they go on to compete on these big scales? Like someone like Hamilo, do you go, okay, your baseline skill set is already pretty strong, let's maintain this, but you need to be in the academy training? Or do you retract from that and say, hey, you're already really good at jiu-jitsu, you're pretty strong, we can get you a little bit stronger? Like, how do you explore those trade-offs with these athletes to make sure that they're maximizing their performance when they actually get out on the mats on those big stages?
Yeah, so some of it can be kind of seasonal and it can ebb and flow through different parts of the year where there are different competitions, and an off season could have more general training for it, and as part of that general training would be more strength training. Part of it can be individual. Uh, Less common now, but when I started doing strength and conditioning for jiu-jitsu guys 15 years ago, many of them, most of them had no strength training background.
Right.
So even though, like, let's say the gentleman right behind me in that photo, Felipe de la Monica, is our head professor at Gracie Baja headquarters in Irvine. He's 38 and has been training jiu-jitsu since he was 10. So I've known him for 15 years. So he was 23. So even at that point, he'd been training for 13 years. He'd been a black belt for, maybe 2 or 3 years. If he had spent all of his time up to that point just doing jiu-jitsu and zero strength training, then yeah, the beginner gains phase of strength training is going to give him pretty good performance returns on the mat. But because he's at that beginner gains phase, it's probably not necessary to like, oh, we're going to dedicate. If you've never done it before, then yeah, lifting 2 or 3 times a week in just a well-structured, like sensibly structured program. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or exotic, and most good programs aren't something fancy or exotic, but they're going to get a huge return from that. So they might have to understand with that, at least early on in it, all right, you're going to be really sore, the first week, 2 weeks. It might detract a little bit of your energy from jiu-jitsu, but ultimately the higher qualified any athlete is, the less return they're going to get from general training. So if they're black belt, finalists at Jiu-Jitsu Worlds at adult, even if they've never lifted before, if they've made it to that point without it at all,
Right.
like, yeah, it's going to improve a little bit, but it's not, it's very rarely like the difference.
Right.
Like even between good and bad, and like good strength training and bad strength training. And I get that I'm like working against my own profession in this. And because it matters that you do something, but until you're getting into the realm of like, way overtraining or doing exercises that are completely inappropriate to develop force production, the things kind of on the fringes of it, most of the training in the middle, it's like, all right, yeah, that helps. It could be a little bit more helpful, but one of my best friends is named Dustin Perry. He's the head strength coach for the 49ers. And, we joke a lot of times that, he'll sit down and he's writing these really intricate detail plans for in season and off season for these guys. And then at the end of it, we're doing like consulting stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, but it doesn't really matter because it's
Right.
like, well, if they squat, 4 sets of 5, are they going to win the Super Bowl? But if they only did 3 sets of 5, will they not win? Kind of thing. Like strength coaches, they, I'm passionate about strength training. I've spent, the last 25 years of my life involved with this as probably my primary pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to think that it's the most important thing to the athlete's success. But I did an interview with Cub Swanson recently, and he asked me about MMA, strength and conditioning role in MMA, and I told him, I was like, I know that I'm the least important coach that they have, and if
Right.
more strength coaches understood that, whether it's for MMA or for jiu-jitsu or for football or whatever, that they're there to complement, to support everything else around it, but it's not to be the star. Look how much my guy bench presses, and now he's going to be good at his sport. Because if that's what they spent most of their energy doing, unless they're powerlifters, they're probably not, deriving much direct improvement from that.
I think that is definitely the error of the new trainer, is thinking that your thing is the most important thing in someone's life, when really it should be a tool utilized to help mitigate injury to the best degree that you can, and then make sure that the athletes are actually out doing the thing that they're getting paid to do, or that they hope to one day get paid to do. Because if you're not practicing the sport, you're not going to get better at it. I heard that you actually on the pitch, they thought you might be like a tailback or a lineman or something. You had a little bit of praise
Maybe
there from the 40.
that was the probably singular peak of my athletic career. This was back in like 2019, and I was in very good shape, much better shape than I'm in right now. I was about 285 and lean, like could see my top 4 abs at 285, and
Wow.
not near my peak powerlifting strength, but plenty strong. Probably squatting 700 something and benching 450, and so I'm out there and doing my workout after we did the consulting stuff with the team, and I've got my shirt off out on the field, and I'm doing the high knees and stuff, and I have a long track background, so my running technique, sprinting technique, and all those drills is pretty sharp, especially for an old big guy. And Dustin told me that there were players who were like, "Is this guy on the team now? Like, who is this?" And so the last time I was up there, this last off season, more similar to the shape I'm in right now,
Peak shape,
we do our consultings,
which is peak performance shape.
and we do our consulting stuff, and then I'm out on the field after, and I'm gonna run my tempos, and pop the old top off, gonna get a little sun, and and I finish up, and or I think I meet Dustin for dinner later that night, and he's like, "Oh yeah," he's like, "John Lynch could see you working out from the window," and I was like, "Oh yeah," and he's like, "Yeah," he looked down there, he's like, "Is that Joe Douglas?" And I was like, "Man, there's Joe Douglas." And at first I took it as a compliment, and then I was like, "Joe Douglas, the Jets general manager?" Like, fuck, And I was like,
Is that Rex Ryan down there?
Yeah. So my hopes got up that John Lynch was impressed for a second, and then I realized he was insulting me. But
I mean,
hey,
it's a feather in a cap. It's a feather in a cap, right? I mean, to be out on the
yeah,
field and have someone even think, it's like, okay, good, this makes sense. When
yeah, not just call
if you
security.
think,
And let me summarize too, real quick.
yeah,
I'm not saying with this stuff that if your bench press goes up that you're going to get worse. I'm saying
right.
that should not be the primary objective of it. You should move the weight faster. Choose exercises that are well suited to producing more force in your sport. Your lifts will likely, unless you're already very, very strong, in a powerlifting sense, they will likely go up. But that should, again, not be the objective. It's more the byproduct.
Well, I can speak to that directly. I mean, when I say I've been doing this every week, I'm extremely diligent. I've missed 1 week due to like severe sickness, but that's it in the last year. And we did the episode it aired on the 31st, and I think you sent me the information that week, and so I started on it. And it's not like I think when people think of an ideal program, if they're not privy to strength and conditioning, it's this bells and whistles, crazy single leg kettlebell snatch, whatever program. And the reality is that the stuff that works, a lot of it's not sexy. It's pretty fundamental, and it's done with smart volume and programming behind it to where it automatically, and this is something I think the app does fantastically because of the feedback and the inputs that you contribute, is that it helps you regulate based on how you're feeling. So the hardest thing for someone to decide as a hobbyist is when to ramp up or ramp down their training, because they already don't really know enough about training in the first place. They're just trying to get their workouts in. And then they rely on the school to regulate the intensity of the jiu-jitsu. But we all know that that's all over the place. So by participating in the app and utilizing it and contributing how you feel, your recovery, where your weight's at, your nutrition, all these kind of things, it does help bump up and down. And as a result, like I've been doing this only on a 2-day-a-week training split for a year, and maybe numbers aren't the most that they've ever been for when I was competing in Olympic weightlifting, of course, but to have them even remotely close to where they are is really surprising. And it's happening, what it feels like as a user of the software, it feels like it's completely by happenstance, because it happens unexpectedly and consistently. And if you're able to roll programs from one to the other, it does a great job of suggesting, hey, you just did a strength block for 8 weeks. why don't you try to make your strength transition to actually produce faster speed in these areas? And so it works really well to work alongside what you're doing. And yeah, if the numbers go up, you feel better. I mean, you feel stronger. This is something I wanted to touch on, that I think is important, because when I field questions from other hobbyists or people that are trained jiu-jitsu, they want to get stronger. The problem with that is that everyone's definition of what strength is typically everything but what it actually is, and they put it within their own parameters, right? So again, there's plenty of YouTube content where you do a really thorough job of explaining this stuff, but I wanted to touch on a couple different parts of strength. So maybe you can define what strength is, touch on maximal, explosive, and isometric, and strength endurance as these components. And so for those listening, this is a denser portion of it, but these are really important distinctions when you're talking about your training.
Yeah, so strength is the ability to produce force. Maximal strength is going to be the ability to produce the highest force regardless of the time it takes, which can be much more seen in like the way that you would see powerlifters often do squat, bench press, and deadlift, where it's slow, it's a grinder, but it goes up. Explosive strength is going to be able to produce that high relative force, but in a shorter time period, which is going to have more impact on, sport performance generally, because there's almost always a time component to the sport, and being able to, beat someone to a point and you're applying your force, even if it's equal force, but before they are, on a force velocity curve, yours goes like this and theirs goes like this, and they might have the same peak, but you got there first. You're gonna win those interactions. Strength endurance is going to be, basically how high of a force can you produce repeatedly without decline. That's going to, particularly in jiu-jitsu, often manifest itself in isometric strength, which is, most movements are going to have a eccentric and concentric portion to them, like a shortening and lengthening of the muscle, but the isometric is going to be more like a static position, a static stretch position of the muscle, and how much can you kind of resist movement in that, like what some strength coaches would call yielding strength. And in jiu-jitsu, it's going to often be how much strength endurance, how long can you apply relatively high forces in that, like if you're trying to finish a guillotine or a head and arm or something, and how long can you keep squeezing hard enough to finish it. So yeah, I think those are all the ones you ask, relatively colloquial definitions, but that's what you get from me because I'm a history major, not a yeah.
So if, let's say someone, I mean, obviously everyone should use an app like this. I think that's the underlying, the promotion, the unpaid promotion here that I'm shouting. But if someone is not, how does the average person start to think about these things? Like, okay, they now understand what the difference is between isometric strength and maximal strength. They've probably attempted some sort of ballpark maximal strength thing in their life, but they can introduce these other things in. If they're trying to reduce the risk of injury, not get completely jacked up like we've both become via the sport, what should they focus their attention on in weighing out these different types of strength pursuits?
Yeah. So as someone kind of does well, yeah. So if someone kind of does a bit of a self-assessment in this, which takes honesty often with themselves, and they can see, I am strong, but my arms burn out, or, if we get in like a certain positions, I'm able to win that out. But if it's a more explosive shooting for a takedown, something like that, I have a hard time. They can, from that, begin to assess like, all right, more of my time relatively might need to be spent in this area, in maximal strength and explosive strength and strength endurance. If that self-assessment comes back with, I'm bad at all of these things, then it's simpler in a way because you don't have to ebb and flow or focus on one more than the other. It can be pretty balanced. And if you have no, real strength training background, it's simple too because everything is going to help. When
Right.
the general strength goes up, it's going to kind of be a high tide that raises all boats there. And until you're more proficient, you won't really need to put, like, your explosive strength is going to get better even without directly addressing explosive strength.
Mhm.
But typically, if someone's trying to set up their own program, assuming they're going to need a little bit of all of these things, and it would be very rare that someone in jiu-jitsu is like so maximally strong that they don't need any and even if they didn't do any general strength and maximal strength work, they're still going to get force production qualities from explosive strength work. So that would be, unless you're coming like from my background, world elite powerlifting into jiu-jitsu, you probably need to do some moderate reps, 3 to 8 reps that feels hard, that you're trying to move it slow, but it feels heavy. My friends at the Massonomics podcast, they have a shirt that says weight is a number, heavy is a feeling. And, so that's maximal strength.
Right.
Heavy is a feeling, if it feels hard. Explosive strength qualities you're going to be able to develop through moving your body through space as fast as possible, sprinting and jumping, throwing medicine balls, throw a kettlebell, throw a basketball that you cut open and fill with sand and duct tape up, whatever gets the job done.
No excuses.
And then, yeah, and then strength endurance, lift a moderate weight. So not something that feels heavy necessarily, as many times as you can, and that could be up to, probably 20 to 40 reps. It could be time based, that you're going to do it as many times as you can in 30 seconds, then the next week as many times as you can in 40 seconds, then 50 seconds, then 60 seconds, then, maybe take a easy week and start again with 5 or 10 more pounds. Think in movement categories rather than specific exercises necessarily. Some kind of squat, some kind of press, some kind of upper body pulling, some kind of twisting, some kind of lunging exercise. All of those going to be useful, much more so than, and some kind of hip hinging, hip extension exercise, particularly with jiu-jitsu, something that tends to be very demanding, damaging, somewhere in that spectrum on the body. Particularly with age, as the older someone gets, the more varied their training history and injury history likely is with that. So you don't feel like, well, this article said that front squat is the best exercise for jiu-jitsu for your lower body, and it's like,
Why?
why? Who cares?
Yeah.
Like, because if front squat is ouch, ouch, my shoulder hurts, my wrist hurts, my knees hurt, whatever,
Right.
but leg press it doesn't, then leg press is a better exercise for you because, until the mat is littered with squat racks and leg presses and everything, like, it's all general. So
Right.
and then also anyone who's training for jiu-jitsu, and for any sport for that matter, needs to understand that your sport is strength training stimulus as well, particularly a combat grappling based sport
Mhm.
where you're working against the resistance of your opponent all the time. And that's providing stimulus, and it
Right.
might not be as simply quantifiable to you, the person doing it, as, well, I did 200-pound bench press for 3 sets of 8 reps, but your body doesn't know bench press or squat or,
Right.
deadlift or jujitsu. It just knows my I'm working. My muscles are trying to exert as much force against this external resistance, whether that's, pieces of metal or a person.
Right.
So understand that the stimulus that gives needs to be accounted for in the training and is valuable. Like, one of the strongest guys I've ever trained with, his name is Jacob Harmon. He's a wrestling coach, church boys, wrestling was his thing. Now Team Thunder Wrestling, and he's coached wrestling for jiu-jitsu for and MMA for tons of the most famous, biggest jiu-jitsu guys in the world. Romulo Buchecha, like Fabricio Verdum, dudes, as well as great wrestlers. Morgan McIntosh was at Penn State, multiple time All-American. Um, Jacob wrestled for Arizona State in like the early 90s, but it's like I never lifted weights. I have never felt a person as strong as him.
Yeah.
And, whether it's his collar tie or anything, it's just like, holy shit. And he's, 5'8", 290, but he could do, gym exercises, like some core type of exercises, like ab wheel from his feet for
All the
20 reps in a row.
he's
He
a
did
unit.
it. Yeah, he did this with TRX straps, where 2 sets of TRX straps. He put his feet in one set and his hands in the other, and did like a full extension, like an ab wheel type of movement.
Yeah, it's like an
That
iron
Romulo
cross,
couldn't.
but horizontally.
Yeah, Romulo couldn't do one. Philippe couldn't do one. Otavio couldn't do one, and Jacob 5'8", 280, 290, just like 10 in a row. Boom, boom, boom. But I say all that. He wasn't lifting weights, metal weights. He was lifting people. Like,
Right.
he was lifting his own person and other people, and that made him insanely strong. And whether it's like farm strength or that wrestler grappling strength, like that that has to be accounted for and understood, the value of that in the training.
Yeah, you said. I actually wrote this down to talk about because I loved it so much. You said, "I'm better at lifting weights than he is, but he's better at lifting people."
Yes,
And I'm like,
yes.
it's such a good way of looking at it. So this was a big error that I made when I first got into jiu-jitsu, as I was balancing this weightlifting and jiu-jitsu. I looked at jiu-jitsu as this hobby. I looked at weightlifting as a sport of strength training and resistance and measured volume and intensity. And so when I started doing jiu-jitsu, I was like, oh, well, this is just active recovery. And so I went lots of weight training in preparation for competitions and lots of jiu-jitsu. And what I got was big injuries that set me back, because I didn't account for the fact that when you are wrestling someone or you have a spider grip and you're putting your foot on their bicep, like that's all doing something to your body. Like you said,
Yeah.
the body doesn't know that you're doing an ab wheel. It doesn't know that you're doing bench press. It just responds to stimulus and resistance. And you're getting that when you're training with your opponents. And I think it's one of the constantly overlooked things by not just new practitioners in general, because as you alluded to, you've been doing this for 15 years. 15 years ago, which is not that long ago, this wasn't even on the table. People weren't thinking about strength training. They were rolling out of the beach with their board shorts and they were going to the mat and they were training. They were doing that over and over and over. So even the idea of training for the sport of jiu-jitsu is somewhat nuanced. And now you're seeing, I mean, there's some guys that potentially are going to start to make money here, and this will become, maybe, I don't know, a thing as ADCC grows and WNO and all these different fight to win organizations and everything. So then when you get the potential to make money, then the training becomes more serious. And then this kind of stuff rises to the top. When you look at the two, well, it's just two sports within the sport. So NoGi Jiu-Jitsu and Gi Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously, Gi Jiu-Jitsu is going to be much more isometric in nature because you have the collars and the sleeves and the legs. But how do you look at strength training as it pertains to performance outcomes in those two different areas? Because now you do have a separation of, not everyone's doing what Hoyler did, where they train in the gi all the way up until a week out of their no-gi tournament, and then they switch over and then they go train. You got guys that are isolated, no-gi only competitors, and guys that are holding it down for the OGs in the gi. Do you adjust any kind of training inputs when you consider the two different modalities of jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, so if we were taking the same person, so all their qualities the same, because there's some individual assessment would need to be done there, but generally, no-gi jiu-jitsu is going to put a little bit more demand on explosive strength than gi jiu-jitsu will, where gi jiu-jitsu might have a little bit more demand on isometric strength, as you mentioned, and maybe a little bit more on maximal strength because it's just slower typically. Less scrambles, less that kind of stuff. the grip training is different, in the difference of grabbing and controlling a wrist versus hooking your fingers into the gi. So this is more like a crushing or supportive grip, and this is going to be a lot more just like specific finger endurance. Even though guys who are really high level competitors, they train so much jiu-jitsu, I don't think they really need to do much extra grip training. If anything, they need to do like the reverse grip training and to train
Extensor
their
stuff.
finger extensors. Yeah.
Yeah.
As I know, like for me, I don't train that much or that hard, but lifting and jiu-jitsu together, like the inside of my elbows will really start to hurt a lot from a lot of gripping in the gi, or if I haven't trained much in a while and get back into it.
Have you found
But
anything that actually the extensor exercise, there's these stupid things on Amazon that are like pieces of shit. And whenever I try to use them, they're so bad. Have you found anything that's actually effective, maybe besides like rice in a bucket, but that actually works at reversing that kind of constant forearm engagement and flexion?
the rice bucket was going to be the one that I mentioned. It's difficult because this can't be loaded near the same way that the regular gripping
Yeah.
and the pulling that comes along with that can.
Mhm.
So it kind of becomes the same way that a lot of corrective or whatever phrase you want to use exercises for anything that's highly specific. So to not go on too much of a tangent, but Melissa, my wife and I both worked with the same physical therapist, a lady named Pei Bokenfuso, and she's based in Australia. So we worked with her over Zoom. And her two main populations she worked with were powerlifters. She was Australia's 52 kilo IPF lifter, same class as
Yeah.
Marissa. And so we're powerlifters and divers, Australian national diving team.
Uh,
And
like synchronized, like high,
yeah,
what's it called?
platform
You go
and,
ahead.
and
Yes.
diving
Sorry.
board stuff. Yeah.
Semantics. Yeah. Platform.
And both very specialized sports and
Mhm.
kind of in the reverse way. She's like, powerlifters are great at extension, at hip external rotation, at resisting rotation. She's like, divers are great at flexion, internal rotation, and trunk rotation. They're spinning
Right.
through the air. So I end up, when the powerlifters are hurt, I give them exercises that would be useful for the divers training. And when the divers are hurt, they get things that are useful for powerlifters because they got to train some of the opposite, just
Yeah. Yeah.
to maintain that. So as long as you're training, I think some of the opposite stuff with the grip, whether that's like a reverse wrist curl, so pulling back rather than always folding in, some extension. Like, is it ever going to be as strong as the other way? Is my Jefferson curl for powerlifting, where I'm trying to go segment by segment in my spine and control the flexion, ever going to be as strong as my deadlift? No,
Right.
because one, it just doesn't really lend itself to
That would be
that.
that would
But
be great. An 800-pound Jefferson curl.
yeah, but two, it's like, well, I have, of all my training, it was 100% of it was for extension and
Right.
0% for flexion, and now 1 or 2% of it is for flexion and 98% is for extension. Well, that 2% is never going to catch up. Same thing with the hand stuff, but just introducing some of it is so much better than having none of it in.
I thought her solution might be to get the powerlifters to get on a springboard and have the divers get in the weightlifting room, and that just looked like it was going to spell disaster.
Yeah.
So actually on this idea of, because I like that's applicable, kind of using different correctives in the opposite planes of motion or the opposite exercises of what you find yourself doing a lot of, especially in jiu-jitsu, because even if you did no grip training, the sport itself is so grip dominant. Everything functions around that. So you're going to get some aggravation there. When you look back on like your powerlifting career, or maybe even like when you were training and competing in track and field, I know that you've had disc issues recently, referred pain. You had these crazy finger issues that happened leading up to your tournament that seem super annoying. Is there even space for you to implement correctives when you're trying to be the strongest that you can possibly be? Or is that trade-off completely asymmetrical, and like adding anything else in really would just detract from your ability to perform?
Oh, there's definitely time for it, and the off-season period for powerlifting, I think, is overlooked and neglected, and it was by me and it was by other people, and I think it happens from first because they want it all now. They want their next meet, their next training cycle to be the best it possibly can be, rather than thinking even in 1 year, time span, rather than one training cycle or one workout. As for me, I fell into this trap of this kind of cycle several times where I would do a meet and it would be good and almost great. Oh man, I missed the one squat. I missed my third bench or whatever, and it's right there to making this huge total. But I'm strong. Like, I'm going to sign up for another meet and do another meet in 10 weeks or 12 weeks. And I'd get in, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks into that next training cycle. And when you're lifting the heaviest weights in the world and trying to put, 1,000 pounds or close to it on your back, even if you're not injured, you're not healthy. So I'd come out of these meets and I'd have 2 or 3 good weeks of training, and then shit would just start to hurt because it's so hard to push it, back to back to back like that. So then after those 2 or 3 weeks, then I'd have 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe 1 or 2 weeks of like shitty kind of injured training of trying to keep it together, then give up, have, a month of rehab, half-assed, powerlifting's fucking stupid, why am I doing this kind of things, and then be like, all right, well, I got to get back in and start doing some stuff. And for me, that would mean the training that I just kind of enjoy more, like some powerlifting, some weightlifting, some strongman, some things that might look like CrossFit, some things that look more like sport strength and conditioning. And I'd do that for 3 to 5 months typically, and then be like, all right, I feel good. I'm kind of hungry, excited to go do powerlifting again, and go and do that. Where if instead of doing that reactively to feeling beat up and burn out mentally and physically, I would have done it proactively, it wouldn't have needed to be 3 to 5 months. It could have been probably 3 to 5 weeks. And that would have been the time where the corrective stuff could be a more prominent role. And then as we get closer to the meet, of course, the training's going to get more specific, and maybe those correctives go away entirely. Maybe they're, just a part of a warm-up. But then when you extrapolate that out, to multiple years of training, and if you're going to be the strongest person in the world or the best at anything, it's going to take years and years. How much more quality training would I have been able to have,
right, with
replacing that bad training, frustrated, beat up rehab type of times, which maybe, took, let's call it 3 months out of every year or 4 months out of every year, and replace that with more general training, including some of that corrective type of stuff, for 4 to 8 weeks out of every year, so 1 to 2 months.
Right.
And it's not, that stuff's not going to make you weaker. It might not make you lift more if a powerlifting meet was today, but it's not. There's not like a surprise meet coming up. So it would help the next training cycle be better, not from the standpoint necessarily of like, well, I didn't put more muscle on or whatever, but if you're healthier and you can do better training longer, you're going to get stronger.
I suffered so much from this. I just recently, on February 14th, ended up in the ER for what ended up being spinal stenosis and full referred pain down into my right arm. And 3 fingers were completely numb. My hand was like a hot plate. It was kind of, actually, listening to you describe what happened after your drive when you had that referred pain down your leg. It was it was similarly crippling and surprising because it wasn't acute. It was an accumulation of, I can think back to that year, and there were a couple different instances where my body was telling me, like, basically, hey, incorporate correctives and rest in your program. And I was saying, to hell with that, and just overtraining. And eventually it just catches up to you, and you can't. I can look back now and be like, wow, that's so dumb. There's so many instances where I could have looked at my year like that and go, hey, maybe when you herniate your neck in a tournament, you don't go back to training that Monday. Like
Yeah.
be smart about that. But it's hard. It's hard to work to like respect rest and actually do that when you're trying to compete in things. Where are you at now with the sciatica and the fingers?
Yeah. I'll answer that in a second, but yeah, to that effect, people, it's tough to pivot a goal to be like, well, I can't
Yes.
do exactly the thing that I want to focus on right now, but I can do this tangential thing that's still valuable. This is hurt, but I can do more mobility. I can't train as hard, but I can fix my diet, whatever
Yes.
it is, and pivot that kind of stuff. And even I see this a lot with the MMA guys I coach, which one of them won his UFC debut yesterday. Is
Congrats.
Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, I tell them, I said you have to be disciplined enough to be lazy, and
You
so
sound like my
many
fiance.
combat
She
sport
says that shit to me
guys,
all the time.
yeah, is there. It's just always more is better.
Yes.
Harder, conventionally understood, harder training is better, but it's hard for them to feel like they're being lazy, so they have to be disciplined to take time off to do things that aren't conventionally difficult, like you know recovery modalities, or even like flow roll, lower intensity type of just technical training. They have to be disciplined enough to be lazy, you know, quotes lazy,
See,
to
this
do
is
that.
sorry to interrupt you, but this is something that I think it's problematic with the existence of social media, because when you talk to high level coaches like yourself who have set records, who've competed at the highest level, and then you're coaching actual people that are really going in there and performing, right? So this guy goes in, he wins his UFC debut. That guy's not a slouch. He's not in the regional casino circuit getting beat up by guys and thinking about whether or not he has a career. He's hopeful, right? He's actually going and doing this. So, and on social media, you get guys you get the David Goggins and this like Cam Hanes mentality of like, if you're not running up the hill 15 times with a fucking rock on your head, then you're being a pussy. And if you're doing that, then you're never going to be good at anything. And it's so far from the truth, because when you talk to people that are actually coaching the real athletes, the biggest thing that they're all trying to do is get these guys to reel it in a little bit and actually like respect rest as much as you discipline yourself to go out there and perform. Do you feel like that?
Particularly with like Cub and I talked about this a couple of times. It's like you get a guy and he's in the UFC. We know he's tough. Like,
Right, right.
there's the mental toughness part of things. Like he would have been weeded out long
Totally.
before that. And I gotta like stress that to these MMA guys that I coach. Like, you have to tell me if this hurts, if you feel bad today. I'm not gonna think you're a pussy. I
Right.
very much think I know that you're tough. Like, that's you telling me, hey coach, can we go change this exercise or do 10 pounds less?
Right.
Yes, of course. The yeah, that's definitely important for people to understand.
I think the UFC is a good example, because I feel like people think that that's step one. It's like, oh, you want to be a fighter? Go try out, go give yourself a shot in the UFC. There's like
Yeah,
a whole iceberg underneath the water of hundreds of thousands of people that failed miserably at trying to make this happen. By the time they get there, there's nothing to test whether or not they are tough. There's promotional stuff to do around that, of them
mm,
trying to make each other look like they don't work hard enough or whatever, so that you put butts in seats. But the fact that they're there is inherently proof that they are that guy. They are
yeah.
tough, and they're all training hard. It's I don't know. I hope that somehow, and I don't know how that happens, but that narrative shifts and you get a little bit of like the coach's insight from people like yourself that actually are really one-on-one with these athletes, so that people don't feel like they gotta just absolutely beat themselves up to become good at something. You gotta have grit and like work hard. You have to put in the diligent training, and you got to do the stuff that's strength training is not sexy and fun all the time, right? A lot of it's just, it's grunt work and it's showing up and getting it done. But if that allows you to perform the thing you want to do, then like that's enough. That can be enough. You can be lazy. That's a very good way of putting it. And that's something
Yeah,
I
I do
struggle
think
with
that the newer generation of coaches, like Cub Swanson is a coach for these guys, he's a coach and manager for, like, Danny Silva was the guy who won yesterday, and Dan Argueta is another guy with him. And as the coaches who have more recently gone through it become, or as the fighters who have more recently gone through it become coaches, and either younger coaches coming up as well, there'll be less of like, well, this is the way we always did it kind of thing, where I have other
right.
guys I work with in different camps with certainly more old school coaches. And it's like, just because it worked doesn't mean it works. Like,
Yes.
yeah, 20 years ago when everyone was less skilled and, the bomba was free flowing, we could just get a bunch of tough guys in the room and beat the shit out of each other. And the guys who came
Right.
out the other side were going to be they were the best,
Right.
and maybe they were the most suited to that kind of training as well. And that's like a whole, different confirmation bias, survivorship bias kind of selection thing. But
Right.
seeing now that, guys like Cub, I think, is doing a really good job, and isn't just, let's just beat the shit out of each other as much as we can 5 days this week, and then we'll be ready. Like,
Right.
no, let's actually like practice our skills, and because we know you're tough, and flash moments of higher intensity and more pressure and that kind of thing, because that is a part of it and being ready for it. But the farther someone gets along, the less they need that, because the more they've done it. Like you hear about, Max Holloway doing like no sparring. It's not,
Right.
doesn't mean that he's not training or training hard. I think a lot of times that training is harder in a different way. So you have
Yeah.
to be more focused to get more out of less.
Well said. Yeah, and that's something I think as you see I always kind of use the example, like you go back to like UFC 50 through 80, it's bar brawls. You got bar brawl
Yeah.
guys fighting bar brawl guys in a bar brawl, and one of them is gonna punchy face the other guy way better than that and win. And now you're seeing a lot more of like the athleticizing of the sport. You're seeing guys that are putting in the work year round. Obviously, the opportunities are getting better. So whenever that happens, things become more sport specific, and it's cool to see these guys able to go in and perform like snipers in there, knowing that they're managing their training well. But it's also setting a better example, I would hope, within those gyms. And it's not to discount their toughness. It's not that they're doing that and becoming soft. They're doing that and then they're going and winning against tough guys, which is
Yeah,
important to remember.
for sure.
I
I guess to get back to your question that I went off of
steamrolled.
10 minutes ago. Yeah. My own health is good enough. It's, good enough to train jiu-jitsu a couple days a week, play golf a couple times a week, lift weights that other people are moderately impressed by. I find
Disgusting.
subpar, but,
Yeah.
all relative. Yeah, I had the back surgery now. Yeah, I can't even complain about it. Like, oh, I just had back surgery because it was 3 years ago. Now, granted, my surgeon did say I had the record for most herniated disc he'd ever operated on, but
Nice.
yeah, not the
That's not a
most
good
distinguished.
notch to throw in the belt.
Yeah,
That's not
but
like getting recognized by the 49ers at training practice, right? That's something
no,
worse.
but probably the only person he'd had done back surgery on, who'd squatted 700 post back surgery. So yeah, it's all good. Like, it doesn't really bother me at all. Yeah, if I lift in the morning, jiu-jitsu that night, play golf, go to jiu-jitsu kind of thing, two in the same day, sometimes makes for a stiff morning the next day, but nothing, that 5-10 minutes of moving around doesn't fix.
I'll say that golf is a bastard. Golf is one of the most
Yes.
unassuming sports that causes more. I probably play once a week, and I go to the range. Like, I try to get like once a week to the range just to try to actually practice, because I'll be infuriated if I just keep playing horribly. But I'll go to the golf range and come back after like 60, 80 balls, and I'm way worse off than a day of training jiu-jitsu or a strength training session. And it's like every time. It's so weird. But I guess if you, from a biomechanics standpoint, even if you're trying to control your shot speed, which is hard to do, it's power. It's like max effort, basically every swing for 80 swings. So it kind of makes sense.
If you want to not swing as hard, or at least not feel like you're swinging as hard, watch a guy from our club is a first year PGA Tour player named Jake Knapp, Knapp,
Yep.
and insane high ball speeds, like 190 ball speeds with the driver, so he can carry it,
Yeah.
330, 340 if he wants to, and he can go up to like 200-mile-an-hour ball speed, but it's the
Jeez.
slowest looking swing, just the real smooth tempo. And he's pretty strong, like probably one of the stronger guys on PGA Tour, and like actually lifts and trains much more athletically than a lot of traditional golf training probably people think of. But
Right.
he'll make you, just watch his swing on a loop and then feel like I'm gonna go do this just like I just watched Jake. It hasn't
How do
happened
you
yet.
feel about like your sports? I mean, powerlifting is almost entirely in like the frontal plane, right? Golf
Mhm.
is almost all transverse. So you're really strong this way. How, do you feel that frustration where you're like, I'm so damn strong and I can't even hit I can't even get this thing to go. I know all the power's inside, but I can't unleash it.
Yeah, I used to be able to hit the ball pre-back surgery. I could hit the ball a lot farther.
Yeah,
Um, Coming from the track and field background, shot putting is a lot
that's
more
true.
similar action.
Yeah.
Um, and the lower body action of it very similar. Back then, I could really swing the shit out of the club, but I didn't have the money or time to play very often, so it didn't matter. But where I'm a better scoring golfer post back surgery, but none of the shots are as impressive to watch. So
Yeah, well, an eternally frustrating sport. There's it's two last things I want to touch on. One of them is, and I've tried to think of a good way to ask this question, but I think I'm going to fumble it in production here. So if you look to Olympic weightlifting is a good example because you can literally see it happen on the platform, and it's exciting where you get a seemingly small person perform a really big achievement in the weight that they secure overhead. I'm assuming, and I just don't know powerlifting well enough, but I'm assuming this is happening in powerlifting as well, right? You get a smaller person, maybe they're 180 pounds, and they pull a significant amount of weight relative to their body weight. For the general person, there's this thing that, like, to be strong, you need to be big. But then these two sports completely challenge this idea, and they show people there are big people doing big things, but there's also small people doing big things. And then if you look at strength to rate ratio, I'm not sure exactly what that skew would be, but it proves over and over again that size isn't the thing that's contributing to their ability to do the sport. So how is that happening? How is a small person able to produce so much force? And is that a genetic gift, or is that something that you can train into as a just individual or hobbyist?
I mean, genetics are going to play a big role in anything like that. People are, some of their muscles are made out of better stuff, and attachment points and insertion angles and everything matter. As cross sectional size of a muscle increases, its ability to produce force does not increase as quickly. So the strongest people in powerlifting and weightlifting are still the unlimited weight class people. They're going to lift the absolute highest weights.
Right.
And that's why, there's things like Sinclair formula and, what they used to call Wilks in powerlifting and is now IPF points or good lift points. But these different formulas that are looking at not just, oh, this person lifted 3 times their body weight, because the biggest weight class people will never be able to do that. But like with enough data and stuff, you can see, well, relatively, this for a super heavyweight lifter is as impressive, more impressive than this one. And
Right.
I guess impressive is maybe a loaded word that's a bit in the eye of the beholder. Um, but yeah, so the even in the lower weight classes, it's almost always going to be the most muscular person in that weight class that's the best, and it's not like you're going to have this guy who's 180, lifting in 181s, let's say for powerlifting, or the I'm not even sure what all the weightlifting classes are now. They've changed them so much, but like the 83, 85 kilo class, um, for weightlifting, and they're like 6'2". No, those guys are going to be like 5'6", and
Right.
super jacked and squatty. And yeah, fiber type, and having a lot of fast twitch fiber is going to make a big difference. And um, having the right limb proportions is going to make a big difference. But it's kind of works the same way as it does for the biggest weight classes too. Like, they train hard and build muscle and teach that muscle to produce more force and refine the technique of the exercises so that those big force producing muscles can work as efficiently as possible in the right sequencing and everything. And there you go. But yeah, if you're trying to lift the heaviest weights in the world ever, yeah, you want to keep getting
Be
bigger.
big.
And yeah, and you're gonna have to have the bone and joint structure to support that. Um, like for me, any given day, I'd probably weigh 315 ish right now. It should probably be more like 295 ish, but there's not, there's not like I had a lot of powerlifting friends, and they were super heavyweight powerlifters, and they weighed 350, and now they weigh 215. Or you see that with NFL offensive linemen
Right.
that, they play at 6'6", 310, and then a year after they retire, they're 6'6", 230, because they were like having to force themselves into being this size. Like, I don't have a 220-pound person hiding inside me. My
Right.
like maybe like 265, but my head's not going to shrink. My knee joints aren't going to shrink
Right.
down.
Right.
Like, so that's all genetic type of stuff. But within the weight class, like, you just trying to get as muscular as you can, because muscle is going to move the weight and produce contractile force, not fat tissue.
Right.
And so, getting as jacked and lean as you can. And if you get too lean, maybe you don't have enough energy for the hard training. So that's, a balance to strike there. But yeah,
How does
moving heavy stuff fast.
how does nutrition play into that? Like, you've so from listening to episodes that you've done, your YouTube content, your constant funny self jabs, I know that, like, the range of where your body's been at pre-competition, in competition, now, post-injury, pre-injury, there's a range. Some of that is the top four abs are showing. Some of that is your 315, but maybe you should be 295. So through your dieting experience, and I say that more just like putting effort on food, right? Focusing on what you're taking in relative to your training output. How has that adjusted? And with the sport of jiu-jitsu kind of in the background here, what are ways that people should think of their food consumption with their training performance goals and their jiu-jitsu goals as a background? Because we can think of, anyone who's going to be like leaner and stronger is going to be a better performer. To your exact point about fat not doing the job, right? It's muscles that are doing the force production. So what should people be thinking about with food, and what's your experience with how that's changed through competing at Pan Ams and Masters and on the powerlifting platform?
Yeah. So my own personal experience might not be the most valuable here. Like, I would be ripped, except for like alcohol and barbecue and pizza and stuff existing, and having no self control. So
Sweet.
yeah, but within the
Appreciate the
context of
honesty, man.
yeah
Yeah.
of performance, you know, it's kind of rare, and performance enhancing drugs can kind of cloudy this entire issue. And you could have someone with a shit diet and they just do a bunch of drugs so they look ripped.
Right.
Um, But all things being equal, whatever that means to the listener, kind of rare that the leanest, most jacked person is often the best sport performance side of things. But it's not that those two are mutually exclusive. It's more that the energy demands are being, misappropriated by that person. That they're probably like, look how jacked I am. I like that, so I'm going to put a little bit more attention to that. It's going to take away a little bit of attention elsewhere. But I think a lot of athletes, young and old, don't get enough protein to support the muscle mass that they want to have or should have. So, probably 0.8 grams per pound of body weight is a good target with that. In terms of fats and carbs, there's great arguments for both sides. Some people just feel better one way or the other. You can find research that is on either side. So meeting your maintenance calories, whether it's higher fats and lower carbs or the other way, I think can be kind of just a personal journey to figure out what you feel better with there. If you're like, well, I feel better, and someone's like, well, look at this paper and it says that you shouldn't feel better, and you're like, well, but I do. Well, then you do. So go ahead and do that. It's fine, because you could probably find another paper that says the opposite. But yeah, I'm probably not the best resource on that. Dr. Mike Israetel, my friend there, he's probably better suited.
How much beer and pizza relative to barbecue should one be intaking for performance? I skew heavy on the pizza.
Yeah, depends on the season. Everything has its phase.
When you look at these guys, you've been in a sport where like drug use has a serious upside. Right? Using steroids can, if the only goal is to be the strongest person in the world, using steroids can seriously assist you in that regard. When you look at all these guys competing in ADCC, unregulated, right, relative to IBJJF, what's your perception on whether or not all these guys are on drugs?
Yeah, they probably are, but the simplest way to have a level playing field is to say that there are no rules and you can do whatever you want. Because if it was drug testing, someone's going to figure out how to beat it.
Right.
No matter how elaborate that testing is. So then that person's going to have a big advantage. That's a nice thing about powerlifting. It makes a very clear distinction. Don't do drugs here. Do whatever you want over here.
Right.
I think, and I, occasionally make the mistake of wasting my time arguing with people on the internet about like this person in the drug tested competition, they're probably clean. They're like, no, like drug tested doesn't mean shit. It's just a IQ test. And it's like, could they be beating the test if they wanted to? Sure. But specifically in powerlifting, it's like, what would be the point when you can just go to this other thing, which is just as prestigious, or you can win just as much small amount of money and do it without the hassle and stress of am I going to fail this drug test?
You're talking about like natural and unnatural. Like that's for people that aren't familiar with powerlifting. Those are distinctions in the
tested
circuit,
and untested.
Right. Beautiful.
And
they should do that for all sports.
Very simple distinction. And there actually is something called the steroid games or something now that is wanting to have like these untested divisions of sports that are typically tested. So, and powerlifting is unique in that way that it's like a hobby. It's everyone, even the best people in the world, it's their hobby. That they're not professional. They don't live as professional powerlifters.
Right.
Maybe powerlifting adjacent things are where their income comes from, but it's not. I get paid by the IPF to just lift, and if you do that, you're
probably paying them actually to lift.
Where something like, weightlifting or track and field, where there's a lot more kind of scrutiny and stigma and stuff associated with the drug use. Yeah, because there's no real alternative. Like if you want to be the best at powerlifting, you can lift in the IPF, you can do untested. It's all subjective in the eye of the fan, I guess, of who's the best and who cares. But if you're going to be the best at weightlifting or best at track and field, like you have to go to the Olympics and win there.
Right.
So there's only tested is the only option. So that's why people try and beat it. Jiu-jitsu, if you're going to be regarded as the best, you're going to win at Worlds, which I think GI Worlds, which I think they're stopping doing the testing now because they're like everyone's testing positive.
Right.
and then no one really cared. The athletes, I don't think really cared when they tested positive because they're like, okay, well, I'll take your 2-year ban and I'll just go and do this NoGi stuff where there's actually money that I can win.
Right.
So they're not going to have testing that's significant enough to really deter people. So yes, it's a level playing field in that regard of you can do whatever you want. And then
Can you explain what does steroids actually do for a competitor? So I think people want to point fingers all the time. They're like, oh well, Gordon's on steroids, or Andre's on steroids, or JT Torres taking steroids, and the athletes, most of them are like, I'm not. Isaac Doderlein, for example, has a big stance on this. He's very brash about the fact that he is the natural king, right? He's not doing this. So what are steroids actually allowing you? It's just recovery, right? It's going to allow you to recover at a rate that other people can't, and so you can produce the same peak performance throughout a cycle. Like, what is it really giving an athlete?
yeah, so it's gonna help the muscles recover faster and a little bit more effectively in the nitrogen uptake of the muscles and all these different sciencey things. And I think Derek, the more plates, more dates guy, can explain that stuff better. But simplest way to say it, it's going to make you get a little bit stronger from the same training than you would have without them, or just as strong, or even a little bit stronger with worse training, from a strength training standpoint.
Yeah.
And then because it improves your recovery between sessions of anything, now you can do a little bit more high quality training, technical training. So then in that, develop better technique, or even if you're doing the same amount of training, because you're more recovered and you're going to have better quality in the same amount of training. So you're going to get marginal technical improvements because of that. In powerlifting, and I'm saying this as someone who did untested powerlifting, right, it makes a difference for sure. It's not like this, oh, I squat 500 and I'm going to do steroids and now I squat 800. Like, no, it doesn't make that big of a difference. It's probably, you could look at a lot of information. I've written about this before. Guys smarter than me, like Greg Knuckles, have written about it. It's probably worth about 10% strength improvement, which is a big number. It's for sure significant. But, that's at the highest levels of powerlifting, someone squatting 880 instead of 800, not right, someone squatting 800 instead of 500. It's still hard training. It's like, yes, if two people did absolutely nothing and one person took steroids and the other person just sat on their ass, or they both sat on their ass, but one was steroids, the steroid person would be a little bit stronger. But that's not really, I guess, the question. It's making them a little bit stronger, even if they're not doing more or better strength training than their competitor, and it's allowing them to do more training or get higher quality out of the same training. But it's not affecting the technical adaptations of training. It's not making you learn your technique better or faster, in the regard that it does help there. If you feel a little bit more fresh, a little bit more alert, a little bit more recovered, you right, can have better technical adaptations, but it's not directly affecting that pathway.
And well, to your point about, like, if being the best squatter made you good at jiu-jitsu, you would be the best in the world. If you took someone and they took steroids and they got much better at being strong, maybe their strength is already a high enough margin that being stronger actually isn't going to improve it, and the steroids aren't making them a more technical grappler. they're making
Correct.
them recover
And but
from strength
there
training.
are, some endurance adaptations as well. Like Lance Armstrong was using testosterone,
Right.
back in the Lance Armstrong days. And there's tons and tons of steroids that do a lot of different stuff. So I'm sure, there are jujitsu guys out there doing testosterone and EPO and all kind of different peptides and stuff like that to, just help them feel better and deal with injuries better and improve their cardio and get stronger. And yeah, it helps, but they ain't going to catch everyone and they're not even going to try. So I still think the simplest way to a level playing field is like, whatever you guys want, go for it.
Yeah. I would love
Because
to.
otherwise someone's always going to beat it.
I would love to watch. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it already is like this because of the viewership, but I would just love to watch steroid use hockey because I already think hockey is so exciting. But it would be or steroid golf. Maybe golf's not tested. I don't know. Are they testing in golf? They're not.
They do test, I think.
Oh, they do. Okay, so
But
they're not doing 500-yard drives, pushing the course out way more.
yeah.
Well, Chad, it's always a pleasure, man. I really appreciate your insights and your expertise. Big fan of the app. I'll continue to use it. It helped me a lot in the regulation of my intensity and just being able to train how I want to train when I want to train and not feel like everything's bogged down with trying to write my own programs and getting injured and stuff like that. So I really appreciate everything you do, the content that you put out, and I really hope the listeners enjoyed this one.
Thanks, Abe. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Hey, friends, Abe here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode and sticking around to the very end. If you want to support it, leave a 5-star review on Spotify or check out www.maynideapodcast.com. Join the mailing list and stay up to date on all things The Mayn Idea, from future guests, sponsorship opportunities, products that I'm using to help me perform at my best, invites to ask me anything, and any upcoming pertinent information to the show. I cannot do this show without you. It is literally why I show up each week and put these episodes together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart from being part of the community. I hope you have a great day.